The document was 4 pages long, standard legal formatting, Korean Civil Act letterhead, 2 signatures at the bottom of page 4, one in black ink, one in blue, a stamp from the Seoul Family Court, a case reference number, 20117-HO48821. It looked completely official. It was completely fake. But here is the part that nobody knew. Not Adaeze, not Jae-won, not the lawyers Jae-won had hired after she disappeared, the ones who had spent 6 weeks searching for any record of a dissolution filing and found nothing, and told him the marriage records were simply incomplete. A clerical anomaly, they called it, not uncommon in cases involving foreign nationals. Here is the part that one person had known for 7 years and 8 months and had never once said aloud. Kim Jae-won and Adaeze Okafor were still legally married. They had always been legally married, and on the morning that Jae-won had stood at the altar of a 2 billion wedding ceremony prepared to marry Oh Yeon-ji in front of 500 guests and 12 live television cameras, he had been, without knowing it, committing bigamy. At that same moment, while Jae-won's convoy had been crawling through Gangnam traffic, and his chest had been hollow and his boutonniere had been perfectly pressed, Kim Myung-suk had been sitting in the back of her own car 3 kilometers away, being driven to the venue. She had been wearing the pale gold hanbok she had selected 4 months earlier specifically for the broadcast cameras. She had been holding a small ivory clutch on her lap. She had been looking out the window with the composed expression of a woman who had arranged everything correctly and was now simply waiting for it to conclude. She had known for 14 months. And she had been on her way to watch her son commit a crime. The lawyer's name was Shin Dae-ho. He was 61 years old, semi-retired, and he had handled the Kim family's private legal matters for 22 years. He called Jae-won on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the wedding that never happened, while Jae-won was in his kitchen in Mapo watching Toby explain to Chi why cereal was technically a type of soup. He let it go to voicemail. Shin Dae-ho called back 4 minutes later. And 4 minutes after that, Jae-won was sitting very still at his kitchen table with the phone pressed against his ear and a single sentence playing on a loop inside his chest, like a recording that wouldn't stop. The dissolution was never filed. Mr. Kim, you were never divorced. Toby noticed first. He always noticed first. It was the thing about Toby. He processed the room before he processed the conversation, reading the air the way some children read faces, and some children read words, and Toby read atmospheres, the whole invisible weather system of a space. He stopped mid-sentence about soup theory and looked at his father. What happened? Jae-won set the phone down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his son. I need to make another call, he said. Give me 10 minutes. Toby looked at the phone, looked at his father's face, filed something away. Okay, he said. And then, because he was Toby, is it bad? Jae-won thought about it honestly, the way he had promised himself he would think about things in this kitchen, in this apartment, with these 2 boys. Honestly, without the managed distance he had spent his whole career perfecting. I don't know yet, he said. It might be something else entirely. Chi looked up from his cereal, said nothing, watched. The second call took 40 minutes. Shin Dae-ho walked him through it carefully, with the measured precision of a man who had been dreading this conversation for a long time and had prepared for it thoroughly. The dissolution papers Adaeze had signed 7 years ago had never been submitted to the Seoul Family Court. The case reference number on the documents was real. It belonged to an entirely different case, a property dispute from 2014, lifted and reprinted on fabricated dissolution paperwork. Someone had gone to significant trouble. How long have you known? Jae-won said. A pause on the line that lasted exactly long enough to be an answer before the words came. I discovered the discrepancy 14 months ago, Shin Dae-ho said. When you announced the engagement to Miss O and I began preparing the necessary documentation. I found no dissolution record. I searched every filing system available to me. Nothing. 14 months, Jae-won repeated. I brought it to Madam Kim immediately, as per my obligation to the family as primary legal counsel. He stopped there, and what came next was not what Jae-won expected. She did not seem surprised, Shin Dae-ho said quietly. That is what I need you to understand, Mr. Kim. When I told her there was no dissolution record, she did not seem surprised. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me to continue preparing the engagement documentation, and that she would handle the matter privately. The cereal box on the counter, the open window, the sound of the park below. She already knew, Jae-won said. Not a question. I believe she has always known, Shin Dae-ho said. Because I believe she is the reason there is nothing to find. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Jae-won said, the original dissolution filing, the one that should exist. What would have happened to it if someone had wanted it to disappear? Shin Dae-ho exhaled slowly. A filing that was prepared but never submitted would exist only as a draft in the originating law office's system. If that office was instructed to destroy the draft and bill the work as concluded, and if the court was never contacted at all, there would be no record anywhere. The marriage would simply appear continuous. Which law office prepared the original paperwork? A pause. Mine, Shin Dae-ho said. 22 years ago, when you first married, I handled all documentation. And 7 years ago, when Madam Kim came to me and told me the marriage needed to be dissolved quickly and quietly while you were in Tokyo, I prepared the paperwork. I prepared it, and I gave it to her, and I assumed she had filed it. His voice thinned. I should not have assumed. Jae-won sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. He did not move to find his mother's number. He did not call his board secretary, or his communications director, or any of the 12 people whose job it was to manage the consequences of things that went wrong in his life. He sat with his hands flat on the table and he looked at the window and the park beyond it, and the ordinary Tuesday morning continuing, without pause or acknowledgement. 14 months. His mother had known for 14 months that he was still legally married to Adaeze. She had known it when she attended the engagement dinner with the O family and toasted to the future of the Kim line with a glass of Krug champagne and told Yeonji's mother that she had never seen her son so ready for his next chapter. She had known it every single time she sat across from him at the family dinner table and asked him, with apparent warmth, how the wedding planning was progressing. She had known it on the morning of the wedding itself, the pale gold hanbok, the broadcast cameras, the front row seat. She had been willing to let her son stand at an altar and unknowingly commit a crime, not to protect the family, not to protect him, to protect the decision she had made 7 years ago, to protect herself from the moment when that decision would finally have to be looked at directly, in full light, without the management of distance and silence and forged paperwork. She had been protecting the lie. Just a lie, nothing else. Jae-won stood up. He picked up his phone. He did not call his mother. He called Adaeze. She picked up on the third ring. In the background he could hear the specific quiet of the Mapo apartment mid-morning, the low hum of the refrigerator, a window open somewhere, the distant sound of the park. He had been in that apartment enough times now to hear the silence and know exactly which room she was standing in. She was in the kitchen, one hand probably resting on the counter the way she stood when she was thinking. He knew that now. He was learning all the small things he had missed. There's something you need to know, he said, and I need to tell you in person. A silence on her end. Not alarmed. Adaze's silences were never alarmed. They were considered, careful. The silence of a woman who had learned that the next sentence could change everything, and had trained herself to receive it standing. How soon? She said. Now, he said. If that's all right. A beat. One breath's worth of space in which she made a decision that her voice gave nothing away about. I'll put the kettle on, she said. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching this and what time it is for you. I want to know who's here for part 2. Let's go. Adaeze had made the tea before he arrived. Not because she was calm, because making tea was what her hands did when her mind needed to stay controlled. It was something her mother had taught her without teaching it, the specific discipline of motion when stillness would betray you. Boil the water, warm the cup, measure the leaves, give your hands a job so your face doesn't have to do all the work. She had learned it young. She had used it often. She had used it more in the last 7 years than in all the years before them combined. Jae-won arrived at 10:47 a.m. She heard him on the stairs before the knock. She had learned his footsteps too, the particular rhythm of a tall man who had spent decades moving through spaces built for people with less presence than he carried. 2 measured steps between each landing. Never rushed, never hesitant. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her face and she looked at his, and in the space between them was the specific understanding of 2 people who have learned to read each other again after a long silence. Not perfectly, not yet, but well enough to know when something is serious before a word is spoken. She stepped back. He came in. She poured. He told her everything. She did not interrupt. This was the thing about Adaeze that had undone him the first time. In Singapore, in a conference room where she had been the youngest person present, and the only one who had waited until he finished his entire sentence before correcting him. She listened the way serious people listen, completely, without preparing her response while he was still speaking, without the small involuntary facial reactions that most people can't suppress when they hear something that affects them. She listened until he finished. Then she set her cup down, and she said, "I need to show you something." She came back from the bedroom with a cardboard folder, dark green, the kind sold at every Nigerian stationery market, the same kind her mother had used for school documents, and her aunt had used for the paperwork she'd carried from Lagos to Atlanta when Adaeze arrived with nothing and needed somewhere to start. She set it on the table between them. Inside were 18 pages, printed emails, handwritten letters, her own handwriting he recognized, slightly younger and more urgent than the controlled script she used now. 2 photographs of documents, and at the back, a single printed page with 3 lines of routing code highlighted in yellow. 4 years ago, she said, when Toby started asking questions about his father, I went looking through old emails. I was going to delete everything, start completely clean. She touched the edge of the folder without opening it further. And I found something in the routing data of a bounce-back message from your company address. The rejection wasn't automatic, it was manual. Someone had set a rule to intercept any message from my email address and return it as undeliverable. Jae-won looked at the folder. I had a friend in Lagos. She worked in network administration for a telecoms company. I sent her the routing code. She told me it was a deliberate filter, set from inside the company server. Adaeze paused. From an admin account registered to your executive assistant, the one before Soo-hyun. Min-jun, Jae-won said. Min-jun, she confirmed. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said the thing she had not said to anyone in 4 years. Not to Ngozi, not to her mother, not to the ceiling at 3 a.m. when the boys were asleep and the apartment was quiet enough to think in. I knew then that you hadn't chosen silence, that someone had chosen it for you. She looked at him directly. But I also knew that someone had access to your company's server admin systems, and that kind of access doesn't come from a personal assistant acting alone. She closed the folder. Someone above him authorized it. I need to pause here for a second because this part of the story, I want to know your reaction. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. And tell me, did you see this coming? Because I don't think most people did. Jae-won picked up the folder, turned it over once in his hands, set it back down. There's something else, he said. She waited. Shin Dae-ho told me this morning that when he brought the dissolution discrepancy to my mother 14 months ago, she didn't seem surprised. He looked at her steadily. I think she has known from the beginning that the dissolution was never filed. I think she kept it unfiled deliberately. Adaeze was very still. If there was no dissolution, she said slowly, working through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, without rushing the conclusion. Then when she showed me those papers 7 years ago, she showed you a document that didn't legally exist, Jae-won said. She fabricated a divorce that she then deliberately never finalized, which means she needed me gone, Adaeze said, but she needed the marriage intact. The words sat between them like something with weight. Why? She said. Why keep the marriage intact if the goal was to remove me? Jae-won was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing he had been sitting with since the kitchen table. The thing that had been assembling itself slowly, piece by piece, across 40 minutes of a lawyer's careful confession. Because a dissolved marriage is a public record, he said. A dissolved marriage can be found, examined, questioned. Journalists can access it. Board members can reference it. Anyone wanting to understand the Kim family history can pull the filing. He paused. But a marriage that simply appears to have ended quietly. A foreign wife who returned home, no formal proceedings, no record. That leaves no paper trail. No evidence of what she did. No document that could one day be used to prove it. Adaeze looked at him. She kept it intact, he said. To protect herself. Not you. Not me. Herself. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the park below, a child was laughing at something. The ordinary city, completely indifferent. She planned for the possibility, Adaeze said quietly, that this day would come, and she built herself an exit. Yes. And then she almost let you walk into a criminal marriage anyway. Yes. Adaeze stood up. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, looking out at the park, and he watched her shoulders, and the particular set of them that he had learned meant she was not upset but thinking, processing, running the architecture of something to its conclusion. When she turned around, her expression was not angry. It was decided. She built this whole structure to protect herself, Adaeze said. But she made one mistake. Jae-won waited. She left the folder, Adaeze said, and placed one hand flat on the dark green cardboard, in a system that her own lawyer accessed. And her own lawyer, she paused, just called you. She looked at him with the specific clarity of a woman who has spent 7 years being underestimated, and has learned to wait for the exact moment when that underestimation becomes the other person's problem. Shin Dae-ho has documentation, she said. Doesn't he? It was not a question. Jae-won looked at her for a long moment. He has everything, he said. The call to Myung-suk came that afternoon. Not from Jae-won, from Shin Dae-ho. A formal written notice of legal withdrawal. 22 years of family representation ending in 4 paragraphs on Kim and Associates letterhead, delivered by courier to the Songbuk-dong estate at 3:15 p.m. The letter cited a conflict of interest. It cited professional obligations. It cited, in careful legal language that meant exactly what it said, and nothing more and nothing less, an inability to continue representing a client whose instructions had placed the firm in a position of legal liability. Attached to the letter was a single additional document, a copy of the original dissolution draft. The one prepared 7 years ago, the one that had never been filed, with Shin Dae-ho's own annotations in the margin, dates, instructions received, the name of the person who had told him the filing had been handled, Myung-suk's name, in his handwriting, dated the week Adaeze had left. At 4:30 p.m., Myung-suk called Jae-won. He let it ring. At 4:31 p.m. she called again. He looked at the screen. He looked at Adaeze, who was at the kitchen table helping Chi with a worksheet about river systems, her reading glasses on, her voice patient and even, explaining the difference between erosion and deposition, with the same focused calm she brought to everything. Chi looked up from the worksheet and glanced at the ringing phone, and then at Jae-won's face, and then back at the worksheet. You should answer it, Chi said, without looking up again. The longer you wait, the harder it gets. 7 years old. The stillest, most certain 7-year-old on earth. Jae-won answered the phone. Myung-suk answered on the first ring. That was the first thing that was wrong. In 37 years of knowing his mother, Kim Jae-won had never once known her to answer a phone on the first ring. She considered it undignified, the behavior of someone who had been waiting, and worse, someone who let you know they had been waiting. She had told him this when he was 14 years old, and she had never deviated from it once. She answered on the first ring, which meant she was afraid. Jae-won, she said. Her voice was its usual register, composed, measured. The voice she had used in boardrooms and at charity galas, and across the dinner table for decades. But underneath the register, underneath the architecture of it, was something he had heard only twice before in his life. Once when his father died, once when the family company had faced its first hostile acquisition attempt in 2009. The specific frequency of a woman who has realized the ground is moving and does not yet know how far it will fall. I received Dae-ho's letter, she said. I know. I would like to explain. I'm not calling for an explanation, Jae-won said. I'm calling to tell you that Adaeze and I will be coming to the house tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I need you to have Young-ah present. A pause. Young-ah, she repeated. Yes, the household manager. 22 years. The woman who had witnessed the sitting room meeting 7 years ago and had saved documentation because she hadn't known what else to do with it. The woman who, and this was the piece Myung-suk did not yet know that Jae-won knew, had not saved documentation only about the sitting room meeting. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, he confirmed. He ended the call. Across the table, Chi had returned to his river systems worksheet. Adaeze was washing the teacups at the sink, her back to him, her shoulders carrying their usual composure. Jae-won looked at his son. Chi did not look up, but the corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. Just enough. They arrived at the Songbuk-dong estate at 8:57 the following morning. Young-ah met them at the door. She was 63 years old, and had the particular stillness of a person who has spent a long career making themselves invisible in rooms where powerful people said things they would later prefer had not been witnessed. She looked at Adaeze when she opened the door, and something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite apology, but contained elements of both. "Mrs. Kim," she said. It was the first time anyone in that house had called Adaeze by that name in 7 years and 8 months. Adaeze looked at her steadily, nodded once. They went inside. Myung-suk was in the main sitting room, not the sunroom. The main sitting room, the formal one, with the tall windows and the lacquered furniture, and the family photographs arranged on the credenza in order of significance. The room where guests were received. The room where distance was maintained. She had chosen the room deliberately. Jae-won recognized it as the last available form of control. If she could not control the conversation, she would control its geography. She was wearing a dark navy suit. Her hair was set precisely. Her hands were folded. She looked at Adaeze, and then she looked at Jae-won, and then she looked at Young-ah, who had followed them into the room and was standing near the door with her hands clasped in front of her. Something shifted in Myung-suk's expression when she looked at Young-ah. Something small and irreversible. The look of a chess player who has just seen the board differently and understood, 2 moves too late, that the game has already been concluded. Jae-won sat down. Adaeze sat beside him. Young-ah remained standing, and Jae-won said, "Young-ah, tell her what you told me." Young-ah had worked in the Kim household for 22 years. In that time, she had witnessed 3 family crises, 2 hostile business negotiations conducted at the dining room table, and 1 occasion when Madam Kim had fired and rehired the same florist within a single afternoon. She was not easily unsettled, but her hands, clasped in front of her, were not entirely still. "7 years ago," she said, her voice quiet and direct, "I was present in the entrance hall when Madam Kim returned from a meeting with Mr. Shin Dae-ho. She was carrying a folder. She went directly to her private study, and I heard the shredder running for approximately 4 minutes. Myung-suk said nothing. The following morning, Young-ah continued, I found a handwritten note in the kitchen waste that had not been fully destroyed. It was Madam Kim's handwriting. It contained 3 items. She paused. A case reference number, a court filing date, and the words, "Never submit." The room was completely silent. "I kept the note," Young-ah said. "I have kept it for 7 years. I did not know what to do with it, and I was afraid. But I kept it." She reached into the pocket of her uniform and placed a small folded piece of paper on the low table between them. This was the thing nobody had known. Not Jae-won, who had built his case on Shin Dae-ho's confession and Adaeze's routing codes and the forensic logic of an unfiled dissolution. Not Adaeze, who had spent 4 years reconstructing the architecture of what had been done to her from the outside in. Not Shin Dae-ho, who had prepared the paperwork and handed it to Myung-suk and assumed, and this assumption had cost everyone, including himself, more than he could calculate, that she had done with it what she said she would. Not even Myung-suk herself, who had shredded the filing instructions and believed, with the particular certainty of a woman who had managed difficult situations for 40 years, that nothing written in haste survives a shredder completely. She had been wrong about that. By one fragment of paper the size of a playing card. Jae-won picked up the note. He looked at his mother's handwriting, the precise, slightly right-leaning script he had known since childhood. He looked at the case reference number. He looked at the filing date. He looked at the two words at the bottom. Never submit. He set it down. Myung-suk was looking at the table. Not the note. The table surface beside it. The way a person looks at a space when they cannot look at the thing occupying it. "Mother," Jae-won said. She did not look up immediately. When she did, something had changed in her face. Not collapsed. Myung-suk did not collapse. But settled. The way a building settles when the last thing holding it at a particular angle finally gives. "I knew," she said. "From the beginning. I knew the papers were never filed because I instructed that they not be filed. And I knew what that meant when Dae-ho came to me 14 months ago." She exhaled slowly through her nose. "I told myself there was still time to resolve it privately, that the wedding would proceed and the marriage to Miss O would supersede. There is no legal mechanism," Jae-won said quietly, "by which a second marriage supersedes a first one." "I know that. You have always known that." "Yes." The word landed without drama, without defense. It was the most unguarded syllable Jae-won had ever heard his mother produce. Adaeze had not spoken since they sat down. She had sat beside Jae-won with the green folder on her lap, and her hands still, and her face carrying that expression, the one that was not cold and not warm, but was entirely, completely present, receiving everything, giving nothing away prematurely. Now she spoke. "I want to ask you something," she said to Myung-suk. "And I want you to answer me honestly, not for Jae-won, not for the lawyers, for me." Myung-suk looked at her. "When I sat in this house 7 years ago," Adaeze said, "and you showed me those papers, did any part of you know that I was carrying his children?" The silence that followed was the longest in the script. Longer than the pedestrian crossing, longer than the cafe, longer than the sunroom. It was the silence of a question that had been waiting 7 years and 8 months for a room in which it could finally be asked, without management or distance, or the protection of a lie between them. Myung-suk looked at Adaeze, and for the first time in the entire history of their knowing each other, across the careful dinners and the polite distances, and the sitting room and the 7 years of silence, she answered without architecture. "Yes," she said. "I suspected. The way a woman suspects. I had no confirmation, but I suspected." Adaeze nodded once. "And you let me go anyway?" "Yes." One word. Twice. The full weight of it distributed across both syllables without reduction. Adaeze stood up. She placed the green folder on the table beside Young-ah's note. She looked at Myung-suk for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this particular truth for so long that receiving it feels less like vindication and more like the end of something she is finally ready to put down. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me the truth." And then she walked out of the sitting room. Jae-won found her in the entrance hall. She was standing near the door with her coat in her hands, looking at the family photographs on the wall. Not all of them. One specific one. A photograph of Jae-won at perhaps 12 years old, standing beside a man who shared his nose and his eyes, and his particular quality of stillness. His father. Before everything. She heard Jae-won behind her and turned. "She suspected," Adaeze said. Not with anger. With the specific exhaustion of a truth finally confirmed. "She suspected. And she handed me a piece of paper, and she told me to disappear." "Yes. And we spent 7 years." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. The entrance hall was very quiet. Somewhere deeper in the house they could hear Young-ah moving. The ordinary sounds of a house that had held an extraordinary secret for a very long time, and was now, finally, empty of it. "What happens now?" Adaeze said. Jae-won reached into his jacket and placed something on the narrow entrance table between them. It was a document, 12 pages. His company letterhead at the top, not Kim Tech Global, his personal holding company. The one that predated every merger and acquisition and board appointment. The one that was registered, legally, in both their names. Because they had never been dissolved. Because they had always been married. "Our lawyer," he said, "drew this up this morning." He paused. "A formal recognition of the continuous marriage, with full legal standing, and a transfer of co-ownership of the personal holding company to both parties, as it should have been registered 7 years ago." Adaeze looked at the document. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything this week, but I needed you to know that the law, regardless of everything else, has considered you my wife for the past 10 years, and I think you deserve to decide what you want to do with that. On your own terms, in your own time." Adaeze looked at the document for a long moment. Then she picked it up. She didn't sign it. She didn't hand it back. She simply held it. The way you hold something you are not ready to put down, and not ready to open, but are finally, after a very long time, ready to carry. "Come on," she said. "The boys finish school at 3. She opened the door. The November light came in. Cold, precise, and entirely indifferent to billionaires and broken families and documents on entrance hall tables. Jae-won picked up his coat and followed her out. The law had called them married for 10 years. It took them 10 years to understand why that was the only thing that had ever been true. Next time, the O family responds. And what they do next is something nobody in the Kim family saw coming. If you made it to the end of part 2, I genuinely appreciate you. This story took everything. Hit like if Adaeze carrying that document without signing it hit you differently. Subscribe if you want to be here when part 3 drops. Because the O family's response is going to change everything we thought we knew about who the real villain is. And leave me a comment. One question only. Whose side are you on right now? Adaeze? Jae-won? Or do you think Myung-suk deserves one more chance to make it right? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single one.